White Sands, Missile Range, 247 AMA convoy moves north on U.S. Route 54. No markings, no lights except the minimum required by law. 3 semi-trucks, military escort vehicles front and rear, rolling through the high desert dark at a pace that suggests both urgency and the confidence of men who own the road. They pass through Vaughn without slowing. Population 286, most of them asleep, none of them watching. Nobody sees what's being transported. Nobody asks. In the morning, if anyone noticed the convoy at all, they'll assume it was routine military traffic. Fort Bliss to Holloman, Holloman to Los Alamos. Classified cargo moving through the dark on a highway built precisely for this purpose, on a route that has served this function longer than most people realize. The convoy passes the rotting Western Skies Motel, the abandoned Harvey House, the shuttered gas stations with their rusted pumps still standing like sentinels over a commerce that vanished decades ago, past Duran's sandstone ruins, past the empty stretch where Antco used to be, through Corona, population barely holding at a few hundred, the buildings along the main street dark and quiet. The road itself is in perfect condition. Recently resurfaced, clearly marked, maintained to standards that seem almost extravagant given the minimal civilian traffic it carries. But that's the point. This highway was never really built for civilians. The towns along it were never what the road was for. U.S. Route 54 runs through a void, and the void isn't empty. It's by design. To understand what U.S. Route 54 is, you first have to understand what it replaced, and what it left behind when it moved on. 3 highways meet in Vaughn, New Mexico: US 54, US 60, and US 285. Once, this junction was the most vital crossroads in the entire Southwest. 2 major railroads converged here, the Santa Fe and the El Paso and Southwestern, the only such intersection in New Mexico. A grand Harvey House hotel served travelers. A roundhouse serviced steam locomotives around the clock. The depot handled freight and passengers bound for California, Texas, Chicago, the Midwest. Vaughn was, for a brief and dazzling moment, genuinely important. In 1920, it had 888 residents. Today, 286. The Western Skies Motel still stands, a massive rotting brick structure, 3 stories of broken windows and collapsing floors, built to accommodate an economy that evaporated before most of its guests had checked out for the last time. Abandoned gas stations from the 1950s dot the highway corridor, their pumps rusted solid, their signs bleached to illegibility. The Harvey House closed in 1936. The roundhouse is gone. The depot stands empty, its waiting room sealed, its platforms cracked and overgrown. Drive through Vaughn slowly, and you'll see a town that was killed not by catastrophe but by efficiency, which is in some ways a crueler fate. When railroads switched from steam to diesel in the 1940s, locomotives no longer needed to stop for water every 100 miles. The maintenance facilities that Vaughn had been built around became redundant almost overnight. The railroad that had created the town simply continued without it, and Vaughn's heartbeat, which had always been someone else's heartbeat borrowed for a while, simply stopped. But Vaughn isn't unique. U.S. Route 54 runs 1,206 miles from El Paso, Texas to Griggsville, Illinois. Through New Mexico, it passes through a landscape of failed promises and crumbling towns, each one a variation on the same story. And the further you drive, the more a certain pattern asserts itself, something that starts to feel less like random economic decline and more like something organized, something intentional. The road stays open, the towns die, and between them stretches something that looks less like emptiness and more like a buffer zone, a human vacuum maintained for a reason nobody along the highway seems inclined to name out loud. This is the story of U.S. Route 54, the highway that serves a purpose its dying towns were never meant to understand. In 1907, the Eastern Railway of New Mexico completed its line from Belen to Clovis, with Vaughn designated as a division point. The town was named after Major George W. Vaughn, a civil engineer employed by the Santa Fe Railroad, a man whose name would outlast every institution that honored it. Within months of the railroad's arrival, workers erected a large 2-story depot, a roundhouse for servicing locomotives, and the Las Chavez Harvey House, an elegant Mission Revival building designed by Chicago architect Myron H. Church that served as both fine restaurant and hotel. It was supposed to be a monument to civilized hospitality in the harsh New Mexico desert, part of Fred Harvey's vision of bringing reliable comfort to the American West one meal at a time. Harvey houses had a reputation for impeccable food, spotless linens, and the famous Harvey girls. Young women recruited from back east who maintained exacting standards of service that made the Fred Harvey Company, effectively, America's first restaurant chain. Charles Lindbergh ate at the Las Chavez Harvey House in 1928 during an emergency landing while surveying transcontinental air routes. He stayed overnight, walked Vaughn's dusty streets, and saw a town at its confident peak. By 1950, Vaughn had reached 1,400 residents. The railroad junction hummed with constant activity. Freight moved in all directions. Passengers changed trains. Workers maintained locomotives. The Harvey girls kept the dining room running with the precision of a military operation. It looked, by any reasonable measure, like permanence. Then diesel engines arrived, and they didn't need any of it. They didn't need water stops every 100 miles. They didn't need the same intensive maintenance. Railroad efficiency improved sharply, which meant Vaughn's reason for existing, its entire economic rationale, vanished with a speed that the town had no way to absorb. The Harvey House closed in 1936, the first domino. The depot curtailed operations. The roundhouse fell silent. Within 2 decades, Vaughn's population had dropped by half. By 2020, only 286 people remained, but U.S. Route 54 kept running through town. The highway that had replaced rail as America's primary transportation corridor didn't need Vaughn either. Not really. It just needed the road to be passable. The town was optional. For a while, Vaughn adapted. Gas stations opened. Diners appeared. Motels went up to serve travelers passing through on US 54. The highway crossroads became the new identity. Then Interstate 40 opened 60 miles to the north and pulled most of the through traffic away, and the motels closed, and the diners shut down. And what remained was infrastructure without economy. Roads that work, buildings that rot. Drive through Vaughn today and you'll see the Western Skies Motel, that 3-story brick monstrosity built to house travelers who no longer come. Now occupied by pigeons and structural collapse. You'll see the shells of 1950s service stations with vintage pumps still standing like tombstones to a buried economy. You'll see a functioning post office, a small grocery, a handful of occupied homes scattered among the abandoned structures like survivors who haven't yet received word that the battle ended. And you'll see US 54, US 60, and US 285, meeting in perfect asphalt maintained by state and federal funds, carrying through traffic that doesn't stop because there's nothing left to stop for. The road works. The town doesn't. That's the pattern all the way down Route 54 through New Mexico. It repeats so consistently that at some point you have to ask whether repetition at this scale is still coincidence. 30 miles southwest of Vaughn, US 54 passes through what remains of Duran, and what remains of Duran is the kind of ruin that stops you mid-sentence. The Duran custom goods store stands in sandstone. Walls still upright, roof long collapsed, windows empty rectangles open to the sky. It looks precisely like a movie set, the kind of post-apocalyptic backdrop that Hollywood location scouts would pay serious money to use. Except this decay is entirely real, the product of decades of wind and sun and absence, doing slowly what art directors try to simulate with aging spray and controlled demolition. Across the road, an abandoned schoolhouse still has desks inside. You can see them through the broken windows, wood and iron, arranged in rows, waiting with a patience that is almost unbearable for students who will never return. Duran was never large, maybe 100 people at its peak, but it had a school, a store, a gas station, a post office. It had the full infrastructure of a functioning community, everything a small settlement needed to sustain itself in the high desert. And then it lost the one thing that all of that infrastructure depended on: US 54 was straightened and repaved. Engineers determined that a more direct alignment made more sense than routing the highway through the settlement. So they moved the road 2 miles to the west. Just 2 miles. That small gap, a distance you could walk in half an hour, starved the town to death in less than a decade. This is bypass death in its purest form. The road didn't fail. No disaster struck. The town wasn't abandoned in a hurry, no Pompeii moment of sudden catastrophe. Engineers simply drew a straighter line on a map, and Duran's economic lifeline was quietly severed. When the traffic stopped passing through, the gas station closed first, then the store, then the post office. The school had no students because there were no families left who hadn't followed the commerce out of town. The buildings were left to the desert, and the desert has been patient and thorough in its work. What remains is architecture without purpose. Structures that once housed commerce and community and daily human life, now inhabited only by wind and the particular silence of places that were abandoned mid-sentence. Here is what the maps won't tell you. U.S. Route 54 through New Mexico is officially designated as a military highway. It connects Fort Bliss in El Paso directly to Holloman Air Force Base, outside Alamogordo. The route provides primary ground access to White Sands Missile Range, the largest military installation in the United States, spanning nearly 3,200 square miles of southern New Mexico, a territory larger than the state of Delaware. White Sands is where the first nuclear device was detonated in July 1945 at the Trinity site in the range's northern reaches, near US 380. It hosts the Holloman High-Speed Test Track, a 10-mile rocket sled facility that routinely achieves speeds exceeding 7,000 feet per second and accelerations above 200 Gs, numbers that belong to a world most people never glimpse. The Department of Defense formally designates White Sands as the largest fully instrumented open-air range in the United States. In its own planning documents, the DoD lists encroachment as a critical operational concern. Development along the range's borders creates liability complications related to radiation exposure, noise, air quality degradation, and the ever-present possibility of civilian casualties when tests go wrong in ways they occasionally do. The solution the documents gesture toward, without ever quite stating plainly: buffer zones, areas with minimal population, stretches of land where tests can be conducted and convoys can move without generating witnesses, complaints, or complications. U.S. Route 54 runs directly through that buffer. Drive the highway carefully and you'll begin noticing things that don't quite add up. Multi-million-dollar concrete overpasses in the middle of nowhere, terminating in dirt roads that lead to no visible destination. Massive interchanges engineered to handle substantial traffic loads in areas where the daily vehicle count barely reaches double digits. Infrastructure that is wildly overbuilt relative to any civilian need that could plausibly justify it. The official explanation for these anomalies, when officials bother to offer one, is future development. Roads built in anticipation of growth that never materialized. It's a plausible enough story, the kind of government overreach that happens in 100 ordinary ways. But there is another explanation, offered by people who follow defense contracting and military infrastructure closely. These are access points for facilities that don't appear on any civilian map: black budget installations, testing sites for weapon systems, and autonomous platforms that require the kind of isolation you can only find in a place that has been systematically emptied of people. Vaughn, Duran, Anco, Corona, these aren't communities the federal government is working to save. They're buffer zones in the process of becoming complete. Human vacuums forming around installations where things happen that require distance from civilian eyes and civilian questions. About 20 miles from Carrizozo, just off Route 54, sits White Oaks, a ghost town with a somewhat different story and a lesson that applies to everything along this corridor. In the 1880s, White Oaks was supposed to be the territorial capital. Gold had been discovered in quantity. The population exploded past 4,000. Banks opened. Multiple newspapers began publishing. The town had opera houses, saloons, hotels, all the infrastructure of a city that expected to keep growing. It looked, by the standards of the frontier West, like prosperity made permanent. Then the railroad came, or rather, it arrived at the negotiating table and presented its terms. Railroad representatives approached White Oak's civic leaders with a proposition: pay a substantial sum to guarantee the tracks would run through your town, or the railroad would find a more cooperative route. It was, in plain terms, a bribe. The kind of arrangement that was entirely standard practice in the railroad era, a system of extraction that built fortunes for the companies and survival for the towns willing to play along. White Oaks refused. Its leaders believed the town's gold production and population gave them leverage, that the railroad needed White Oaks more than White Oaks needed the railroad. They held to a principle when pragmatism was what the moment required. They were wrong in the total and irreversible way that matters most. The tracks went to Carrizozo instead. Within a decade, White Oaks was dying. The gold mines played out, as gold mines do, and without railroad access, the cost of transporting ore to market became prohibitive. Businesses closed in sequence. Families left. The would-be territorial capital became a gallery of abandoned buildings and the particular melancholy of roads that used to go somewhere. Today, White Oaks draws tourists who come to photograph the ruins, walk through the old cemetery, and contemplate the gap between what was almost and what is. The lesson it offers is useful, but not comfortable. In the American West, infrastructure determines survival. And infrastructure follows power, not population, not principle, not the reasonable expectations of people who built something real and expected it to matter. US 54 runs past Carrizozo, the town that made the deal. It's still there, barely, population around 1,000, functioning without thriving, sustained by the fact that it once understood how the game was played. White Oaks is ruins. There's another thing you'll notice. Driving US 54 through New Mexico's emptiest stretches, if you know what you're looking at. Fiber optic lines running alongside the highway that are not the standard telecom infrastructure you'd expect along a rural route. Military-grade dark fiber. Cables engineered for massive, high-speed, high-security data transfer, connecting the nuclear sites and weapons testing facilities scattered across the southern New Mexico desert in a network that serves no commercial purpose and serves no residential community along its path. The towns along Route 54 have buildings with no running water. Their schools closed decades ago. Their populations are too small and too old and too poor to make commercial broadband investment worthwhile. But they're wired, or rather the corridor they occupy is wired, with fiber optic infrastructure capable of handling the data throughput of a mid-sized American city. The official explanation, when one is offered, rural broadband initiatives, federal programs to connect underserved communities to the modern internet. The reality visible from the road is somewhat different. The road isn't for the people, it's for the data and the cargo. US Route 54 forms a ground-level spine connecting Los Alamos National Laboratory in the north, accessible via connections through Santa Fe and Albuquerque, to Sandia National Laboratories, to White Sands Missile Range, to Holloman Air Force Base, to Fort Bliss in El Paso. These installations collectively receive billions of dollars in federal defense funding annually. They conduct classified research on nuclear weapons systems, advanced missile technology, directed energy weapons, autonomous ground and aerial vehicles, and the emerging infrastructure of AI-driven warfare platforms. The fiber running through Vaughn and Duran and Corona serves those installations, not the towns. The towns are incidental to the route. They exist along the corridor that the corridor requires, and the corridor requires them to stay quiet and emptying. And here's the thing about dying towns along a military corridor. They're not a problem, they're a solution. Low population means fewer people asking questions about convoys moving at 2 a.m, fewer witnesses to unusual activity, fewer complications when roads need to be closed for routine missile tests, fewer local journalists, fewer city council members, fewer engaged citizens who might notice something worth investigating. The dying towns aren't a bug in this system. They're a feature that the system requires. Ancho tells the same story as Duran, with minor variations. In the 1930s and 40s, Ancho was a functioning community. School, post office, gas station, a few dozen families building something modest but sustainable in the high desert. The highway ran directly through town, and the town organized itself around that fact, as every small community along a highway must. Then engineers decided, for entirely sensible reasons of traffic efficiency, that a straighter alignment made more sense than routing the road through the existing settlement. They built a new section 2 miles to the east of Ancho. Just 2 miles. Within a decade, Ancho was finished. The school closed in the 1950s when there were no longer enough children to justify keeping it open. The post office shut down. The gas station couldn't survive without passing traffic to sustain it. Families moved to Carrizozo or Alamogordo, places where the highway still ran through town, where economic life was still possible. What remains today is a cluster of abandoned buildings visible from the highway if you know where to look and slow down to look for it. Most drivers pass without noticing. Most drivers have no reason to notice. Ancho doesn't exist as a destination anymore. It's ruins in the desert, a settlement that bet everything on being along the road and lost when the road moved on without it. The pattern repeats all along US 54, with the consistency of something structural rather than accidental. Towns built on the assumption that highways are permanent commitments, learning too late that highways serve systems, and systems have no obligation to the communities that happen to lie along their paths. When system requirements change, when efficiency demands straighter geometry, when military operations demand wider buffer zones, when traffic shifts to faster corridors, the towns become expendable. The road adapts. The towns don't. In 2013, a company called Pegasus Global Holdings announced an ambitious and genuinely unusual project: the Center for Innovation, Testing, and Evaluation, or CITE, a billion-dollar purpose-built ghost city designed as a testing ground for emerging technologies. The concept was straightforward in its strangeness: construct a full-scale American city, complete with residential neighborhoods, commercial districts, functioning traffic systems, water and power infrastructure, designed to house 35,000 people. Then leave it empty. Use it as a controlled environment for testing autonomous vehicles, smart grid systems, advanced surveillance technology, and robotics. All the things you can't safely test in a place where actual people live and move and have legal rights to be protected. The CEO of Pegasus Global Holdings, Robert Brumley, made the case publicly and persuasively. You can't test a driverless car in a real city without accepting real risk, he argued. You can't evaluate smart grid systems in a functioning power network without threatening real customers. You need a controlled environment that looks and functions exactly like a real city, but with zero population. The logic was sound. The vision was coherent. Investors apparently found it compelling. The proposed location, somewhere in southern New Mexico, within practical range of the installations and testing corridors along US 54. Ground was supposedly broken near Lee County in the state's southeastern corner. Construction allegedly began. By some accounts, substantial infrastructure was completed before the project entered its next and most peculiar phase. In 2017, GTE was quietly canceled. There was no official explanation of any substance, no accounting for the $200 million in funding the project had raised. No investigations from regulators, no lawsuits from investors who had presumably lost significant money, no bankruptcy proceedings, no public recriminations from anyone who had participated. The project simply, and this is the word that keeps appearing in accounts of CITE, disappeared. This is the detail that troubles researchers who follow defense contracting and black budget programs. When legitimate private development projects of this scale fail, and they do fail regularly, they fail loudly. Investors sue. Regulators investigate. Executives dispute publicly. The financial wreckage is visible and documented for years. CTE generated none of that noise. It was announced, it raised hundreds of millions of dollars, it allegedly broke ground, and then it was gone, leaving behind no lawsuits, no investigations, no public argument about what happened to the money. Some researchers report finding evidence that construction continued after the official cancellation. Satellite imagery showing activity at remote sites in the region, increased vehicle traffic on desert roads that terminate at no officially acknowledged destination, fiber optic installations that don't correspond to any known civilian project or any publicly acknowledged military program. Whether that evidence is reliable is difficult to assess from outside. What's easier to assess is the logic. U.S. Route 54 runs through the area where CITE was proposed to be built. The highway provides exactly the kind of access such a facility would need. Close enough to serve it logistically, remote enough for genuine operational security, surrounded on all sides by buffer zones of dying towns where the population is too small and too isolated to sustain much curiosity about construction activity in the desert. The corridor has precedent for exactly this kind of secret development. White Sands Missile Range hosts facilities that didn't appear on any publicly available map until years after they were operational. Holloman Air Force Base contains entire sectors that require active security clearances simply to acknowledge out loud. Los Alamos National Laboratory operates buildings whose purposes remain formally classified decades after they were constructed. Whether CITE was secretly completed, genuinely abandoned, or was always a cover story for something that had no intention of being publicly disclosed, the proposal itself is revealing. It shows precisely how the defense establishment thinks about this corridor, as controlled territory, as testing ground, as a stretch of the American landscape, where the normal relationship between civilian infrastructure and civilian oversight doesn't fully apply. Lay the timeline out, and the pattern becomes difficult to read as coincidence. In the 1940s and 1950s, railroad towns along US 54 begin dying as diesel locomotives eliminate the need for the water stops and maintenance facilities that were their entire reason for existing. This is understood at the time as simple technological change, and in isolation, that's exactly what it is. In the 1960s and 1970s, highway realignments begin moving the road away from small communities. Ancho, Duran, and similar settlements are pushed 2 miles off the main route. Population collapse follows within a decade in every case. Engineers describe these realignments as efficiency improvements. In isolation, that's accurate. In the 1980s and 1990s, Interstate 40 opens 60 miles north of Vaughn, pulling most of the remaining through traffic away from US 54's central New Mexico corridor. Motels and diners that had survived the railroad's departure sit close in the wake of this second blow. The economic base of the surviving towns erodes to almost nothing. Through the 2000s and 2010s, White Sands Missile Range expands its testing operations. Holloman Air Force Base increases its pilot training programs for F-22 and F-16 aircraft. The buffer zone requirements around both installations grow. The towns along the corridor continue depopulating. From the 2000s to the present, Vaughn's population drops below 300. Multiple settlements along the corridor have crossed into ghost town status, but the fiber optic infrastructure along the corridor expands. Road maintenance continues at standards that exceed what civilian traffic requires. Military traffic on the highway increases. Each step in this sequence has an innocent explanation available. Taken together, they describe something that looks less like a series of unrelated economic forces and more like a managed process. Systematic depopulation aligned, whether by coordination or by convenient coincidence, with expanding military operational requirements. The Department of Defense's own planning documents identify encroachment as a critical concern for White Sands operations. Civilian development near active testing areas creates specific complications: liability exposure for radiation, noise violations, air quality degradation, and the worst case, civilian casualties during accidents that the military would prefer happen in places where there are no civilians to be casualties. The solution implicit in those documents is not to restrict military operations. It's to ensure that no civilians are positioned close enough to be affected when something goes wrong. Natural, economically driven depopulation accomplishes that goal more efficiently and with far less political friction than forced relocation or buyout programs would, If economic abandonment and infrastructure neglect are already clearing people from sensitive areas, why would the military act to reverse that process? Better to let market forces do the work and let the buffer zones form without anyone having to sign an order. The Las Chavez Harvey House, that elegant Mission Revival building, designed by Myron H. Church of Chicago, built as a monument to what Fred Harvey called civilizing the West, stands abandoned in Vaughn, or stood. By now, it may have collapsed entirely. The last photographs I found showed the roof caving inward, the walls crumbling at their cornices, the windows reduced to empty rectangles through which you could see open sky where ceilings once were. Charles Lindbergh slept there in 1928. Harvey girls served meals there with a precision and warmth that had made the Fred Harvey Company's name synonymous across the entire Southwest, with reliable quality in places where quality had no particular reason to show up. Passengers changing trains ate there and trusted that the food would be good and the service honest, because that had always been the Harvey House's promise, and the Harvey House had always kept it. Now it's ruins, a monument to infrastructure that served a transportation system that no longer exists, maintained at exactly the level of effort required to let it fall apart gracefully. What makes it haunting is the contrast that the highway itself creates. When US 54, US 60, and US 285 were upgraded to handle the traffic loads that military use requires, engineers built new infrastructure. Wide lanes, modern signals, clear signage, well-maintained surfaces, right alongside the decay. They did not restore the Harvey House. They did not invest in Vaughn's commercial district. They built what the highway needed and left the rest to continue its patient collapse. The message is embedded in that contrast. This road serves the future, and the future has no use for Harvey houses or railroad hotels or the communities that grew up around transportation systems designed for human travelers. It needs roads that connect installations, roads that carry data, roads that provide access for purposes the towns were never informed of and never meant to understand. Drive through Vaughn today and you experience a cognitive dissonance that takes a moment to identify. Perfectly maintained highway infrastructure, passing through architectural decay at advanced stages. The road working exactly as designed, carrying you past everything the road was supposed to support, all of it dead or dying. A town killed by efficiency that continues to exist only because the road needs somewhere to intersect. There is a footnote to Vaughn's history that rewards attention because it suggests that the corridor's dual purpose, civilian transportation layered over military utility, is not a recent development but a founding condition. When Charles Lindbergh made his emergency landing in Vaughn in 1928, he wasn't barnstorming. He was conducting a systematic survey of transcontinental air routes on behalf of the U.S. government and the emerging commercial aviation industry, mapping paths that mail planes and eventually military aircraft could use to cross the country efficiently and reliably. His survey route through New Mexico followed the established railroad lines, which is logical. Railroads had already identified the terrain with the lowest obstacles and the most consistent grade. But those routes also happened to connect the military proving grounds and weapons testing facilities that were already operating in southern New Mexico, some of them publicly acknowledged and some not, in 1928. Lindbergh stayed at the Las Chavez Harvey House. He walked Vaughn's streets, saw a railroad junction operating at full capacity, ate a decent meal, slept in a clean room. What he was mapping, at least in part, was how the military could move personnel and material across the Southwest using infrastructure that the civilian economy had already built and paid for. Nearly a century later, those same routes serve the same dual purpose, with the civilian rationale stripped away and the military function standing more or less alone. The towns built to support civilian transportation have become vestigial. They still exist on the maps, still have post office designations and census entries, but they serve no function that the road requires. They persist as waypoints along infrastructure that has long since moved on to other purposes, carrying traffic that has no use for them. Here is what nobody along this corridor says plainly. The depopulation is convenient. convenient enough that its convenience might be, at some level and in some offices, deliberate. When towns die through economic forces, through technological change and shifting infrastructure and the ordinary brutality of markets, nobody has to take responsibility. No one relocates residents or provides compensation or defends a policy of displacement in front of a congressional committee. The people simply leave, following work and opportunity the way people always have, and the land they leave behind remains technically private property while becoming functionally available. Tax foreclosures accumulate. Structures decay past the point where restoration makes financial sense. Ownership becomes unclear, then nominal, then irrelevant. At that point, the land becomes acquirable. Legally purchased at county auction, quietly assembled through third-party entities, incorporated into buffer zones that serve the operational requirements of facilities that can't afford complications from civilian proximity. The government doesn't have to invoke eminent domain. It doesn't have to justify the acquisition or compensate the displaced. It just has to be patient and let the process that was already underway complete itself. U.S. Route 54 runs through the result of that patience, mile after mile of emptiness that is not actually empty. It is controlled void, maintained absence, strategic depopulation that serves purposes the dying towns were never told about and were never meant to understand. The highway doesn't fail these communities. It succeeds at something else, something the communities were never the point of. U.S. Route 54 still runs through New Mexico. The pavement is well maintained. The bridges are solid and regularly inspected. The road serves its purpose without interruption, moving traffic between military installations, providing ground access for testing and training operations, carrying classified data through fiber optic lines buried alongside the highway at depths and specifications that civilian broadband programs don't require. The towns die. The road doesn't. That's both the tragedy and the design, and by now it's difficult to say where one ends and the other begins. Vaughn's population has dropped from 1,400 to 286 and continues declining. Duran is ruins open to the sky. Anco is abandoned. Corona holds on with a few hundred residents who haven't yet found reason to leave. White Oaks is a ghost town that draws weekend tourists who photograph the cemetery and drive home by dark. But the highway works perfectly. It connects Fort Bliss to Holloman, provides access to White Sands, links the testing facilities and research laboratories that constitute New Mexico's real economy, the one that doesn't appear in the travel brochures, more effectively than any railroad junction ever could. The lesson U.S. Route 54 teaches is darker than bypass economics or the ordinary churn of technological change. It's about infrastructure built to serve systems that regard human settlement as complication rather than purpose. Highway 395 in California enabled Los Angeles to extract Owens Valley's water and leave the valley to collapse. The Dixie Highway connected communities across the South and Midwest, then abandoned them when interstates offered more efficient routes. Those were tragedies of changing priorities and unintended consequences, painful but not planned. U.S. Route 54 through New Mexico feels different. The emptiness isn't a side effect of decisions made for other reasons. It reads, the more you examine it, like an operational requirement, a condition that the system using this corridor needs to maintain in order to function as designed. You can't test missiles in proximity to dense civilian population. You can't conduct classified weapons research with an audience. You can't move unmarked cargo through areas with active local journalism and engaged civic institutions. So the towns die, not through malice exactly, but through a strategic neglect that amounts to the same thing in its outcomes. No economic development, no infrastructure investment beyond what serves military purposes, no policy intervention to reverse decline. That is, from certain perspectives, precisely what success looks like. The Western Skies Motel in Vaughan stands as the monument to all of this, a massive structure built for an economy that moved on without a backward glance, now rotting in full view of a highway that carries traffic with no use for it. The fiber optic lines running through towns without running water complete the picture. This infrastructure serves purposes that have nothing to do with the communities it passes through. Drive US 54 north from El Paso through the high desert, and you'll see landscapes of genuine and austere beauty. Mountains at distances that make them look painted. Sky so large and unbroken that it produces a mild vertigo. Light that changes by the hour across surfaces of rock and scrub and distance. You'll see ghost towns and working ruins, abandoned buildings and occupied ones that look like they're considering their options. What you won't see, unless you're looking for it and know where to look, the installations beyond the horizon, the testing facilities tucked into valleys between ranges, the convoys moving through at hours when civilian traffic is minimal and witnesses are few. The void isn't empty. It's controlled, maintained to specification, purposefully emptied and kept that way. The highway serves that purpose exactly as designed, connecting the installations, providing the access, moving through buffer zones where population decline produces precisely the kind of isolation that certain kinds of work require. U.S. Route 54 didn't fail the towns along its path. It succeeded completely at serving the system that needed it built, and that system never required the towns to thrive. It only ever needed them quietly and without drama to get out of the way.